So, imagine you're the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation.
Okay.
Your supply chain spans the entire globe. You've got thousands of independent contractors, incredibly complex shipping logistics, and highly coordinated distribution networks.
Sounds like a standard Fortune 500 setup so far.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And your profit margins are just absolutely astronomical. I mean, the kind of margins that would make tech billionaires and hedge fund managers blush.
Yeah.
Your customer base is incredibly loyal too, practically guaranteeing your revenue streams year after year. And you're completely insulated from broader economic downturns, inflation, or global recessions.
It sounds like the absolute pinnacle of capitalist success, really.
It does, right. But there is a catch.
Always a catch.
Your entire operation is completely illegal.
Right.
You cannot use traditional commercial banking to deposit your billions. You can't rely on municipal police forces or international treaties to protect your physical assets.
No calling the cops when someone steals your shipment.
Exactly. And if you encounter a severe business dispute with a key supplier, or maybe an aggressive competitor, it is definitely not going to be settled gracefully in a brightly lit courtroom with teams of corporate litigators.
Definitely not.
Today, you and I are going to look at the world through a completely different lens.
Yeah, we are taking a strictly analytical, kind of cold and calculated look at a subject that is almost universally clouded by emotion.
And morality, right?
Morality, cinematic drama, all of that. In today's conversation, we're focusing on the economic principles outlined in shadow markets, the economics of narcotics and laundering.
Right.
And our mission here is to completely strip away that Hollywood dramatization of the global drug trade.
Yeah, we're leaving behind the flashy cars, the action movie shootouts, the moral implications. We really want to evaluate this purely as a complex, highly efficient macroeconomic system.
Because beneath the surface of what the state defines as organized crime, there lies an incredibly sophisticated, globalized network of supply, demand, risk management, and capital allocation.
Let's just bypass the usual true crime narrative entirely today.
I agree completely.
Because if we are exploring the literal mechanics of cartels and the intricate processes of capital obfuscation, money laundering, we have to treat these organizations like the Fortune 500 entities they essentially are.
We really do.
We're going to examine the specific financial architectures of these systems, breaking down the operational realities without using those kind of patronizing analogies.
Right. To set the baseline, we need to really operationalize the term shadow market.
Yeah.
It's a term thrown around in geopolitical thrillers all the time, but in economics, it defines a very specific set of conditions.
So let's define it. What makes it a shadow market?
Well, the foundational element of a shadow market, particularly when we're talking about narcotics, is that it operates under the exact same immutable laws of supply and demand as any legal regulated market.
It's still basic economics.
Exactly. The divergence occurs in the regulatory environment. It functions in a completely invisible, unregulated space. There are no consumer protection agencies, there are no occupational safety standards, no official quality control boards, and absolutely zero legal recourse for a breach of contract.
But despite all of that missing infrastructure, it still works.
That's the fascinating part. Despite this total absence of state-sanctioned regulation, the market continuously finds an equilibrium.
Buyers demonstrate a demand curve.
Yes, and sellers manage a supply curve, and eventually a price is established. However, the variables dictating that price point are fundamentally different from the variables pricing a commodity like, say, crude oil or commercial wheat.
Let's interrogate those variables then. Because the profit margin on illicit narcotics is often cited as the most staggering metric in global trade.
It really is.
Why does the valuation of a plant harvested in the Andean region, or maybe a chemical synthesized in a clandestine lab, undergo a markup of tens of thousands of % by the time it reaches a mid-level distributor in North America or Europe?
That's the golden question.
Because in a legitimate supply chain, value is added through manufacturing, intellectual property, or specialized distribution.
Yeah.
But here, the product itself barely changes.
Right. The valuation is driven almost entirely by the risk premium.
The risk premium.
Yeah. Think about it. In a legitimate commercial market, the retail price of a good is a composite of raw materials, labor, transportation, marketing overhead, and a calculated profit margin.
Buying a cup of coffee, you're paying for the beans, the shipping, the barista's time.
Exactly. But in a shadow market, the price must absorb a massive compounding risk of long-term incarceration, total asset seizure, or lethal violence.
Right.
Every single node in that supply chain, from the agricultural cultivator to the chemical refiner to the cross-border logistics coordinator, all the way down to the street-level distributor, they all assume immense personal and legal liability.
And they want to be paid for that risk.
Absolutely. They require financial compensation proportionate to that liability. The illegality of the product acts as a compounding, invisible tariff that just exponentially drives up the cost of goods sold at every single handover.
We can actually map that out with hard data to see those multipliers in action.
Yeah, let's look at the numbers.
If we look at the traditional cocaine supply chain, the farm gate price for the raw coca leaves required to produce a kilogram of cocaine in Colombia might hover around a few $100s.
Just a few $100 for the raw material.
Right. Once it is refined in a jungle laboratory, the wholesale export price jumps to roughly $2,000 to $4,000.
Still relatively low in the grand scheme.
Exactly. But the moment that kilogram crosses into the United States, say, arriving in Miami, the wholesale price skyrockets to $25,000 or $30,000.
A massive jump.
Huge. And by the time it is broken down for retail distribution in Chicago or New York, the aggregated street value exceeds $100,000.
And remember, the underlying chemical compound hasn't improved in quality.
In fact, it's likely been diluted.
Yeah, cut with other substances to increase the volume. The value appreciation is purely a monetization of evaded border security.
That's a great way to put it, a monetization of evaded security.
The data really highlights that the physical product is actually a negligible fraction of the final retail price.
Yeah.
To contextualize this, consider the global supply chain of a high-end semiconductor chip. The cost of a microchip is heavily weighted by the billions of dollars spent on research and development, hyper-specialized fabrication plants, and intellectual property.
You're paying for the tech.
Right. In the shadow market, you are not paying for R&D.
What are you paying for?
You are paying for the engineering of custom-built semi-submersible vessels to evade Coast Guard radar, or the localized bribery of port authorities in Rotterdam or Antwerp.
Wow.
You are compensating a logistics network for operating under the constant threat of a multi-agency federal indictment. The hazard pay and the specialized evasion infrastructure constitute the bulk of the consumer price.
Okay, let me push back on the traditional law enforcement narrative here because this brings up a massive economic paradox.
Go for it.
When federal authorities execute a major interdiction, say they seize a multi-ton shipment of illicit goods at a commercial port, they inevitably hold a press conference declaring a major disruption to the cartel's operations.
We see those all the time.
Right. The table's piled high with the seized product. But if we apply pure economic theory to that event, are they actually disrupting the market, or are they just manipulating the supply curve?
The economic reality of interdiction is quite counterintuitive, actually.
How so?
When law enforcement seizes a massive shipment, they are introducing a sudden artificial supply shock into the market.
They're artificially restricting supply.
Yes. However, because we are dealing with narcotics, the demand curve is highly inelastic.
Meaning people don't stop buying just because it's harder to get?
Exactly. The consumer base does not proportionally reduce their consumption just because the price spikes or the supply tightens. Consequently, you have a drastically reduced aggregate supply meeting a rigid, unyielding demand. The immediate macroeconomic result is a rapid spike in the wholesale and retail price.
So if police seizures artificially inflate the price and make the remaining trade exponentially more profitable for those who successfully evade detection, it suggests that aggressive border enforcement actually acts as a price support mechanism for the cartels.
That's the paradox.
They are essentially culling the supply to ensure the profit margins remain astronomical for the shipments that do get through.
It is a well-documented economic paradox, though it requires a nuanced view of the cartel's overhead.
Right, because losing a shipment still hurts.
Right. While the gross profit margin on the successful shipments increases, the interdiction also raises the cartel's operating expenses. They have to replace the lost product, compensate for the seized transportation assets, and perhaps increase the bribes paid to secure alternative routes.
It's not free for them.
No. But the overarching effect of this dynamic is that it heavily favors massive, highly capitalized organizations.
I see where this is going.
A small, independent smuggling ring might be entirely bankrupted by the loss of a single shipment.
But a multi-billion-dollar cartel.
Conversely, absorbs that loss as a standard cost of doing business. It's the shadow market equivalent of corporate retail shrinkage.
Like a supermarket factoring in stolen goods.
Exactly. They simply pass the increased cost onto the consumer, and the resulting higher prices only serve to consolidate their market dominance by pricing smaller competitors out of the logistics game.
That consolidation leads directly into the concept of cross-elasticity, which is dramatically reshaping these shadow markets today.
This is a huge shift.
When the price of organic narcotics like cocaine or heroin becomes too high due to successful interdiction, or the supply chains become too risky, the inelastic demand doesn't just sit idle.
Right, consumers don't just stop.
We see a substitution effect. Consumers shift toward cheaper, more readily available synthetic alternatives like fentanyl or methamphetamines. And from a corporate logistics standpoint, synthetics represent a massive evolutionary leap for these organizations.
The shift to synthetics completely rewrites the legacy economic model we just discussed.
How does it change the game?
Well, with organic narcotics, your supply chain is geographically bound. You need specific climates, massive tracts of agricultural land, and thousands of peasant farmers.
It's a huge agricultural operation.
And it is highly visible to satellite surveillance and vulnerable to crop eradication programs. Synthetics, on the other hand, decouple the supply chain from geography.
You don't need a farm anymore.
Exactly. They can be produced in a warehouse in a major metropolitan area using precursor chemicals sourced from legitimate pharmaceutical or industrial supply chains.
Which changes the risk profile entirely.
Drastically. It reduces the physical footprint, lowers the cost of production to mere pennies per dose, and dramatically shortens the logistical distance to the end consumer. The profit margins on synthetics dwarf even the traditional risk premium we mapped out for organic products.
So if the profits are that immense, and the barriers to entry for synthetic production are relatively lower than controlling thousands of miles of Andean farmland, the natural market response would be a flood of new competitors.
In a standard market, yes.
In a purely free market, that influx of competition would trigger a race to the bottom in pricing, eroding those astronomical profit margins. But that doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't.
And the reason it doesn't happen brings us to the operational necessity of the cartel structure. We need to analyze this not as a criminal syndicate, but as an advanced corporate entity.
Yes. Stripping away the criminological terminology, a cartel is a fundamental economic construct.
Let's define it purely in economic terms.
In pure microeconomic theory, a cartel is an association of independent producers or suppliers who collude to control market supply and artificially fix prices.
It is a formal agreement among competitors to suspend perfect competition.
Exactly. In the legitimate corporate sphere, we see this heavily regulated or outright banned by antitrust laws because it is detrimental to the consumer.
Because perfect competition forces companies to innovate, reduce costs, and lower prices to capture market share.
Right, which is great for you and me as buyers. But for the suppliers themselves, perfect competition is financially exhausting. It continuously compresses their profit margins.
We see legal or quasi-legal examples of this operating globally all the time, though.
We do.
OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, is the textbook example of a functioning cartel in the legitimate economy.
It's the perfect parallel.
Sovereign nations that produce crude oil recognize that if they all pump at maximum capacity, the market floods, the price per barrel plummets, and their national revenues collapse.
So we collude.
They hold summits, establish strict production quotas, and artificially restrict the global supply of a commodity with relatively inelastic demand.
And by doing so, they maintain a high price floor and guarantee sustained, maximized revenue. A narcotics cartel is executing the exact same macroeconomic strategy, just operating outside the protections of the World Trade Organization.
The structural parallels are identical.
They are. The leadership of a shadow market organization recognizes that brutal price competition, or worse, violent territorial competition, is incredibly inefficient.
It's bad for business.
Very bad. It destroys physical infrastructure, results in the loss of specialized human capital, and draws intense scrutiny from federal law enforcement and military forces, all of which drastically increase operational overhead.
Therefore, forming a cartel, establishing clear territorial monopolies, and fixing wholesale prices is a highly rational, profit-maximizing corporate decision.
It is an attempt to impose order and predictability onto an inherently chaotic market environment.
Okay, but the critical divergence between OPEC and, say, the Sinaloa cartel lies in dispute resolution.
That's the real friction point.
If two legitimate corporations enter into a joint venture or a supply agreement and one party breaches the contract, They don't resort to armed conflict.
No, they deploy corporate attorneys.
Right. They file a lawsuit in Delaware, a judge reviews the contractual obligations, and the state enforces the settlement through financial penalties.
The legitimate economy is entirely underpinned by the state's monopoly on contract enforcement and the protection of property rights.
But in a shadow market, you are operating entirely outside that legal framework. So how do these multi-billion-dollar entities manage contract enforcement without access to a judicial system?
That absence of a state-backed legal framework necessitates the creation of an alternative, privately funded justice and enforcement apparatus.
A private army, essentially.
Basically. Because a cartel cannot litigate a breached contract or stolen shipment in civil court, they are forced to utilize coercive, often violent, mechanisms to enforce agreements, collect outstanding debts, and maintain broader market stability.
It's just a different tool for the same corporate function.
In this environment, an organization's reputation effectively becomes its corporate credit rating.
Let's dissect the economics of that violence, because it is rarely random. It is highly calculated.
Very targeted.
If a mid-level distributor accepts a multi-million-dollar consignment on credit and fails to remit payment, the cartel cannot simply write it off as bad debt, nor can they garnish the distributor's wages.
They can't just send it to a collections agency.
Right. They have to signal to the entire market that defaulting on a credit line carries an unacceptable cost.
The violence deployed in these scenarios is an economic signaling mechanism.
A signaling mechanism.
Yeah, from an operational standpoint, it is the shadow market equivalent of aggressively liquidating a competitor or bankrupting a fraudulent supplier in court. It enforces the rules of the game so that future transactions across the network can proceed with a baseline of operational trust.
It creates a predictable environment.
Exactly. Without that severe, predictable enforcement mechanism, the entire localized economy of the cartel would rapidly collapse under the weight of rampant fraud, theft, and unpaid debts. The sheer threat of retaliation acts as the binding agent for illicit contracts.
But this requirement for private contract enforcement drastically inflates the organization's administrative overhead.
Oh, massively. Keeping a standing enforcement arm is not cheap.
If we look at the historical evolution of these groups, comparing the Cali cartel in the 1990s to the modern iterations of Mexican cartels, we see distinct corporate structures designed to manage this overhead.
It's fascinating how they've evolved.
The Cali cartel operated much like a centralized, vertically integrated multinational corporation. They had highly compartmentalized divisions for logistics, political bribery, and financial management, prioritizing discrete corruption over overt violence.
They ran it like a traditional conglomerate.
Right. But modern organizations often operate more like a decentralized franchise model, outsourcing localized violence and retail distribution to smaller affiliated gangs while maintaining control of the highly profitable wholesale border crossings.
The structural shift from a centralized monolith to a decentralized franchise network is a direct adaptation to increased regulatory and law enforcement pressure.
How does that protect them?
Well, a centralized structure, while highly efficient at moving capital and product, presents a massive single point of failure. If authorities dismantle the executive board, the entire supply chain fractures.
Like cutting the head off the snake.
Exactly. A decentralized cellular model is far more resilient. The central leadership manages the macro logistics and the international bulk purchasing, but they license their brand, their established smuggling routes, and their enforcement reputation to autonomous regional cells.
Like a fast food franchise model.
It really is. This franchise model outsources the highest risk activities, street-level distribution, and localized territorial defense, while insulating the core leadership and their capital from direct legal exposure.
Okay, but even with that insulation, if the cartel successfully navigates the supply chain logistics, enforces its contracts, and maintains its oligopoly, it runs headfirst into a catastrophic logistical crisis.
A crisis of success.
Yes. The business model is so incredibly lucrative that they literally generate too much physical cash.
It's a surreal problem to have.
We aren't talking about digital numbers on a spreadsheet. We are talking about pallets of $20 and $50 bills. This is the cash problem, and it transitions us into the absolute necessity of capital obfuscation or money laundering.
The cash problem is the fundamental bottleneck of the entire shadow economy.
Because there's too much paper.
Right. At the retail level, the narcotics trade is a cash and carry business. While the wholesale transactions might involve digital assets or bulk commodities, the millions of daily street-level transactions yield an overwhelming volume of small-denomination fiat currency.
Just mountains of street cash.
For the executive tier of a cartel, possessing $1 billion in physical cash is not an economic asset. It is a severe, acute liability.
Because you can't do anything with it.
It cannot be legally invested, it yields zero interest, it is highly vulnerable to theft or rival seizure, and it is physically difficult to store and transport.
There's that historical anecdote about the Medellin cartel, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They were writing off nearly 10% of their cash reserves annually due to spoilage from rats and water damage in hidden bunkers.
Literally rats eating the profits.
Perfectly illustrates the friction of unbanked capital.
So if you attempt to introduce that capital into the legitimate financial system, say walking into a commercial bank to deposit a few $100,000, or attempting to purchase commercial real estate outright with cash, you immediately trigger an avalanche of anti-money laundering protocols.
The AML firewall.
Right. The Bank Secrecy Act and Global Sigh. Know Your Customer regulations mandate that financial institutions file suspicious activity reports for any transaction exceeding a specific, relatively low threshold.
Usually around $10,000.
The entire apparatus of modern global finance is designed as a firewall to prevent unverified capital from integrating with legitimate markets.
Therefore, the survival of the cartel and the preservation of its wealth depends entirely on the sophisticated circumvention of that firewall.
They have to get past it.
The process of money laundering is the systematic methodology of disguising the illicit origins of capital, transforming dirty liquidity into clean, legally defensible assets.
And from an economic and forensic accounting perspective, this process is generally categorized into three distinct, highly technical phases, right?
Yes. Placement, layering, and integration.
Let's analyze each phase critically, bypassing the simplistic analogies. We need to look at this through the lens of corporate finance.
Okay.
The first stage, placement, is the highest risk maneuver because it involves the physical introduction of illicit cash into the legitimate financial system. It is the moment the shadow economy touches the regulated economy.
The most vulnerable point.
How are sophisticated organizations executing this at a multi-billion-dollar scale today? Because surely they aren't just sending people to ATMs anymore.
No, traditional methods like smurfing, where vast sums are broken down into thousands of microdeposits by a network of individuals to stay below reporting thresholds, are increasingly obsolete.
Because of the algorithms.
Exactly. Modern algorithmic transaction monitoring catches that instantly. Today, sophisticated organizations rely heavily on trade-based money laundering, or TBML, and the exploitation of cash-intensive front businesses.
How does TBML work in practice?
In TBML, illicit funds are used to purchase legitimate commodities, say consumer electronics or agricultural equipment, in one jurisdiction.
With the dirty cash.
Right. These goods are legally exported, sold at a discount in a second jurisdiction, and the proceeds are deposited as legitimate international trade revenue.
So now it looks like they just sold some tractors.
Exactly. Alternatively, they acquire heavily cash-reliant businesses, commingle the illicit cash with the legitimate daily retail revenue, and deposit the aggregate sum. The illicit funds are thus disguised as standard commercial turnover.
But once the capital breaches the banking system, it is still dangerously proximate to its illicit source.
It's in the bank, but it's still warm.
If federal investigators audit that front business or scrutinize that specific international trade invoice, the origin of the funds can be exposed. That necessitates the second phase, layering.
The labyrinth.
This is where the financial architecture mirrors the complexity of high-frequency trading or complex derivative markets. What happens during the layering phase?
Layering is the deliberate, rapid obfuscation of the financial audit trail. Once the capital is placed, it is subjected to a dizzying velocity of transactions.
Moving it as fast as possible.
The objective is to sever the forensic link between the placement event and the ultimate beneficiary. This involves wiring funds through a labyrinth of anonymous shell companies registered in jurisdictions with impenetrable corporate secrecy laws.
Like Delaware, the British Virgin Islands, or Panama.
Exactly. The capital might be converted into multiple global currencies, funneled through decentralized cryptocurrency mixers, or used to purchase and immediately resell complex financial instruments.
It's all about creating noise.
The sheer volume, speed, and cross-jurisdictional complexity of these transactions are designed to exhaust the resources and legal reach of any single law enforcement agency attempting to follow the ledger.
A prime historical case study of this scale of layering is the Wachovia bank scandal from the late 2000s.
A classic example.
The bank was found to have failed to apply adequate anti-money laundering scrutiny to over $378 billion, with a B in wire transfers from Mexican currency exchange houses, or casas de cambio.
Almost $400 billion. Unbelievable.
These exchange houses were effectively acting as the placement and layering vehicles for the Sinaloa cartel. They deposited massive amounts of physical cash in Mexico, converted it to dollars, and wired it through Wachovia correspondent accounts in the United States.
The Wachovia case perfectly illustrates the systemic vulnerabilities within global correspondent banking.
Correspondent accounts being the key here.
Right. Correspondent accounts allow foreign banks to conduct transactions in U.S. dollars through an American financial institution. The cartels exploited this by layering their funds through these localized Mexican exchange houses, which then aggregated the funds and utilized the correspondent accounts to access the global banking network.
They just slipped right into the global stream.
The staggering volume of capital moving through those accounts essentially normalized the anomalous transactions. It highlights a critical, often uncomfortable reality of global finance.
Which is?
Massive liquidity, regardless of its origin, generates significant fee revenue for the institutions processing it, which can sometimes misalign compliance incentives.
That's a very polite way of saying the banks were making too much money to ask hard questions.
It's an economic reality of the system.
So once the capital has been layered through shell companies, correspondent accounts, and international wire transfers to the point that its origin is mathematically untraceable, we reach the final stage: integration. The end game. The capital is now legally defensible, taxable income. How do they integrate it?
Integration is the reintroduction of the fully laundered capital into the legitimate economy. The cartel executives, utilizing their network of shell companies and offshore trusts, deploy this clean capital to acquire massive, legitimate assets.
Real stuff.
Yes. They purchase prime commercial real estate in major global financial centers: London, New York, Vancouver, Miami. They acquire controlling stakes in legitimate logistics and transportation corporations.
Which, ironically, can then be utilized to facilitate further illicit supply chains.
Exactly. It feeds back into the loop. They invest heavily in sovereign wealth funds, high-end art, and corporate equities. At this stage, the capital is indistinguishable from the wealth of a legitimate tech billionaire or a multinational conglomerate.
The profound irony of this entire macro system is that the shadow market is not attempting to overthrow or destroy the legitimate global economy.
Not at all.
It is entirely dependent on it. The end goal of running a high-risk, multi-billion-dollar illicit logistics network is not to hoard physical cash in a subterranean vault.
We established the rats will just eat it.
Right. The objective is to successfully integrate that wealth into the very legal frameworks: stable property rights, regulated stock markets, and secure banking systems that the cartel inherently violates to generate the capital in the first place.
It's a paradox.
The shadow economy operates as a massive, localized parasite that ultimately feeds its extracted wealth back into the host of global financial capitalism.
It is a closed-loop economic cycle.
How does the loop sustain itself?
Well, the massive risk premium generated by the illegality of the narcotics trade provides the initial hyperaccumulation of capital. Then, the sophisticated, often brutal cartel structure provides the corporate governance and logistical stability required to sustain that accumulation.
And then the laundering.
And finally, the labyrinthine process of money laundering provides the critical bridge, funneling the illicitly generated capital out of the chaotic shadow market and securing it firmly within the protected, regulated vaults of the legitimate global economy. The systems are fundamentally inseparable.
So as you process the mechanics of these overlapping economies, the next time you see a headline about a massive border seizure or a new international kingpin, look past the immediate law enforcement narrative.
Look at the economics.
Recognize the rigid macroeconomic principles dictating every move, the inelastic demand driving the price, the corporate consolidation of the cartels, and the complex financial engineering moving the capital.
And consider the ultimate consequence of the integration phase we just detailed.
Yeah, think about the scale of it.
If the shadow markets generate hundreds of billions of dollars annually and a substantial percentage of that capital successfully navigates the layering process to integrate into the legal economy over the last several decades.
Just astronomical sums of money.
How much of the modern, tangible infrastructure surrounding you, the luxury high-rises reshaping the skyline of your nearest metropolis, the massive logistics firms operating on the highways, or the foundational liquidity of the banking systems managing your own retirement accounts, was quietly, originally seeded by the hyper-efficient economics of the global drug trade?